Okay, welcome everyone to the session on ID services. Before we start, I want to acknowledge that I'm living and working on the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. The presenter today is Doug King from TAPS. Doug has a long history of working with various advocacy groups, worked before as a lawyer at Pivot and now is the ED of TAPS. He's also worked with ID clinics and other groups that have ID clinics as well. So he's got that background. So I'm going to let him start. As I said, I'm going to take the dog out and we'll see you later. Thanks. Over to you, Doug.
Good morning, everybody. As Lois said, I'm Doug King. I'm with Together Against Poverty Society. Calling in today from the unceded territory of the Lekwungen people. TAPS is located in downtown Victoria, close to where the original Songhees settlement was before they were relocated to multiple places in Victoria. First of all, I want to say thank you all for making it. This is try number 2. For those of you who tried to call in a couple of weeks ago, I really do apologize. You may have noticed in the news, there's a few stories about illnesses going around. I didn't have COVID, but whatever I had was pretty bad. I didn't actually have a voice, which is why we couldn't do the presentation last time. And my voice is back, but I still have a little bit of trouble with it. So we're going to try to keep it relatively short and sweet. I'm entitling this presentation LATC After Hours, since it's kind of this weird zone 2-3 weeks after the LATC has occurred, but it's kind of like an offshoot session of the LATC. Little different since it's all online, but my goal today is to teach you some of the real basics about requests for ID services. A lot of us, I think, over the last few years have started to get more and more requests from clients who are asking for help getting primary and secondary ID. And more we're starting to see ID services being linked to government benefits and it being harder to access certain types of benefits if proper ID isn't available. So my presentation is called ID Services and You. It's going to be relatively straightforward, but from my experience doing ID work over the last few years, there are a couple things, a couple kind of tricks of the trade that can really help you as you're assisting somebody try to obtain ID. It's in theory, a straightforward process until it's no longer a straightforward process. And for the most part, on the ID clinic that we've run in Victoria and the ones that I've supported in Vancouver, we've probably seen almost every single possible situation arise at this point. And really what it takes is communication and treating ID as if it's just as important or just as lengthy as one of your other files. So I think maybe that's the first thing I would say is we often think of ID as like a simple application or side project. From my experience running an ID clinic here in Victoria, often ID files can be just as extensive and require just as much work as an income assistance file or residential tenancy file. Let's see if my slideshow actually works. So why ID is important? Most of you probably know this already. ID itself is a gateway to accessing a wide variety of services in our society. The most important one probably in our work is accessing income assistance and disability benefits. So if you have a client who is looking to get onto income assistance or disability, verifying their identification is a part of that process. Now, over the years, the ministry has become a little bit less intense about having ID up front before an application can be processed. And often now, if you have a client without any identification, they will be able to access benefits. But that doesn't mean that they still don't have to go through the identification process. And what we see more and more now is when someone gets on income assistance or disability benefits but doesn't have primary ID to prove who they are, there will still be a directive from the ministry for that individual to obtain that ID, or else at a certain point down the line, 2 or 3 months when they least expect it, a hold will be put on their check and then they're in a crisis situation. So often the process of getting ID is going to be adequate for income assistance in the ministry to let the file proceed as long as they know that an ID application is in the process. But it is ultimately something that has to be fulfilled. Obviously, for banking purposes, and able to open a bank account, unless you're one of those people who happens to be lucky enough to live in Vancouver, where there's a specific bank set up in the Pigeon Park Savings, where there's kind of like a support system in place to help with the ID process. If our clients are looking to set up a bank account and they're running into, the traditional banking system, then they're going to need that 2 forms of ID in order to open an account. Things like libraries, community centers, accessing the kind of higher level of municipal programs. If you're living in a city, often all of those things require ID as well. And then all sorts of other benefits that come around with it. So, a lot of the recovery benefits, vaccination passport, some of the things that we've seen in the last 2 years, more and more we're starting to see the government push towards a kind of electronic services. The BC Services card has now been moving online, and they're starting to push more and more onto kind of an online engagement process to accessing benefits and things. All of that is predicated on having that identification. In the last 5 years, we've gone from somebody being able to get a really basic non-photo MSP card so they can access healthcare services, to being told that they have to get a BC Services card, which is an incredibly lengthy process. And now the BC Services card is going to be this kind of all-inclusive ID, which is necessary to access a wide variety of things. And it's going to be more and more important for low-income members of society to be able to access that. I'm going to leave plenty of time for questions at the end, by the way. But really, the goal here is to give a bit of the different types. So you just have a general sense of what you might get asked by your clients when your clients are asking for support. So in terms of ID language, one of the only universal kind of terms used in pretty much every province is primary versus secondary. So primary ID being your very first kind of initial application. So primary identification is your birth certificate if you were born in Canada. If you were not born in Canada, it's whatever kind of federal document you were given, either your record of landing or your status card, or your permanent resident card, I should say, or your citizenship card. So those are your primary document. And then once you have your primary document, you're able to obtain secondary, and secondary is typically what we call photo ID. This is the BC Services card. It is a holy grail of ID. The reason why I put this up here is to remind, often when people come in, they might say, I need help getting a birth certificate, or somebody's saying, well, I need a birth certificate for this. But it's important to ask them what their end goal is, what they're actually trying to get to in the end, because often somebody will say, oh, I need a birth certificate, but the only reason they actually want the birth certificate is to get their BC Services card. So it's important to have that conversation, mostly because, obtaining a birth certificate is one process. Getting the services card / driver's license is an entirely separate process. Depending on where that person was born, both of those things together could take the better part of a year, to be perfectly honest. So it's really important just to let that person know that they're looking at a relatively lengthy process, and it could take quite a while. One of the best things about getting a services card, even though it's extra effort to get there, once somebody has a services card and they're in the BC Services card system, at that point, it's going to be a lot easier for them to get a replacement card. So if they're able to get a replacement card from BC Services, that's going to be significantly easier than to go through that process all over again to start to get a primary ID and then support that primary ID to get your services card. And I guess on that note, I should just say, the vast majority of times when an ID file needs to be open and when you need to help somebody get ID, it's because they're starting from scratch. So they have no form of ID whatsoever. The vast majority of the clients that we saw at the ID clinic that we ran in Victoria were people who were either homeless at the time or coming out of homelessness, or for whatever reason, they have lost all of the documentation and they're starting from the very beginning again. So kind of like the broader question, how to provide services. A lot of that really depends on where you're located. As we all know, the Law Foundation funds a variety of programs across the province. Some of them are in urban settings. Some of them are in much more rural settings. If you're in a relatively small town or in a rural setting, you're not going to be able to necessarily set up the kind of ID clinic or bank that you might see in an urban center. In Vancouver, we have ID clinic and bank services, as we do here in Victoria. But in most places, you know, it's really going to be more about just giving an individual support or representation to somebody and trying to obtain their ID. So if you think you can set up an ID services like a clinic or a bank, in many ways, it's definitely the preferred model. The clinical model is really just about setting a time and a place where people can drop in and get their applications done. We have always found that a clinical model runs better for ID because our primary client is going to be somebody who is either living unhoused or in the shelter system, and appointments are going to be a lot harder for them than just knowing that there's a general time period or a place where they can drop in. So we found the clinical model works really well for that. Even better than the clinic model is what's called an ID bank, which is really just where you're not only helping somebody with the application, but you have the ability to store their document after it's been received. So the ID bank model really just recognizes that for a lot of people who are struggling with ID, even when they get their ID, if they don't have solid housing, if they don't have a secure place to store that document, then it could be just a matter of weeks or days before that document goes missing again, or if their belongings are taken. We've had multiple clients who were unhoused. We took multiple months to get them an ID. Within a week or two, their belongings had been stolen and it was lost again. So the bank model is designed to create a secure place where people can store that document. They can come and get it. They can take it away for whatever use they need it for, and then they can return it back to the bank. And if possible, it's definitely kind of the gold standard. And one thing to consider too is if you have a long-standing relationship with a client, they may ask you whether or not you can store their documents for them. There isn't necessarily anything that prohibits you from doing that on an individual basis. You just want to make sure that you're really clear with them, you know, how they obtain it, and that there isn't any issue with them being able to get it in the future if, for example, you move on to a different position or the organization changes. So the number one application that typically people ask for help with is just the good old BC birth certificate application. So thankfully, we live in a province which has a very straightforward application, which is pretty typical and easy, and doesn't require ID to get ID. The number one thing, British Columbia is one of those provinces, and you'll see there's just a stark difference between provinces that will allow somebody to obtain a birth certificate without showing picture ID and those that require it. Thankfully, BC is not one of those places. So for the BC application, you can do it by paper. You can do it online now. If you have the ability to remit payment online and support the client through payment, then online is definitely the way to go. It's much faster, it's much easier, but you can still do it the good old paper way as well. For British Columbia, it's really a relatively straightforward application, which just gives basic information to confirm that person is who they say they are. The most important one being the birth details. So information about where that person was born, their date of birth, that sort of thing. Now, BC, like many provinces, is one of those applications where you'll get clients who know some of the information, but they might not know everything. And the biggest thing that they probably might not know is they might not know their parental details in terms of what their parents' full name was or where their parents' birthplace was. That's the most common thing that's missing from the application. When we submit BC applications that don't have full detail, we will typically attach a cover letter with a very simple explanation for why that person doesn't know that information. So if somebody was in a foster care situation, or if they were adopted at a young age and so they don't know their parents' place of birth, you just need to put that on a really simple cover letter, attach it to the application. Those are the ones that you probably want to do by paper rather than online, and then tell vital statistics the reason why that information is not available. Pretty consistently, we find that BC is pretty good at accepting applications if there's an explanation involved. And also they're pretty good at telling you if it's not. So if an application doesn't go through, they should be reaching out to you on the contact information that's provided on the application to let you know and tell you what you need to do to confirm that application. Not all provinces are that good. So obviously cost is a barrier, cost is an issue. There is virtually no way to get the cost waived. So the cost still has to be paid in some form or another. The one exception to that is when we were operating the ID clinic here in Victoria, there's now the Social Planning Council here in Victoria that's operating for us. we actually got a relationship with Vital Statistics. We reached out to them and say, hey, we're running this clinic. We provide service to individuals who are unhoused. They're not going to be able to pay the application fee. And Vital Statistics agreed to waive the fee when the application came in under our letterhead, under recognition that it was from the clinic. Now, if you have a kind of consistent client base, or you're getting a lot of requests for ID, you also have the ability to do the same thing with BC or any of the provinces. You can actually reach out to them, try to find the right person to talk to, and just let them know what your situation is and see if they're willing to basically create a relationship with you, so that if you're sending applications, either they're not going to cover the filing fee, or they're going to understand that they're missing information. Creating that relationship with Vital Statistics made it a lot easier to process applications. That being said, there is now a ID supplement that's provided from the Ministry of Social Development. So if you have a client that is on income assistance or disability that needs to obtain their birth certificate, their primary ID, the ministry does process applications for the ID supplement, and will basically cut a check for the amount that it costs to get your birth certificate, which is typically $27. The one catch, though, the hitch, is that the ministry is not going to send your application for you, and they're not going to receive your application. So if you have a client who's unhoused that doesn't have an address that they can receive it, they're going to have a hard time getting that supplement from the ministry, because the ministry only wants to provide payment. They don't necessarily want to take on the role of getting your identification for you. So what we typically do is we help somebody, we can put our address down on the application to receive the document, and then they can take that application to the ministry and show that it's ready to go, and then the ministry can cut the payment check for them. It's an extra step, though. And honestly, with a lot of people, sometimes that extra step might be the barrier for them not being able to complete the application. So for that reason, our organization, we actually do set aside some money in our budget to cover application fees for ID, so that our staff know if they've got somebody that needs to get ID to process an application to get a benefit for whatever reason, then we have the ability to say, don't worry about the ministry, don't try to get it covered. We'll just pay for those funds here through TAPS, and then we'll be able to do that. So something to consider. And Jen just said, yeah, locally MSD office will send and act as an informal bank, but only for copies. And I think you'll find every office is probably a little bit different. So it doesn't hurt to ask your local ministry office what they're able to do in terms of ID. I don't think there's a specific direction from the ministry of like boundaries and what they must or must not do. So you might find some disparity about what each office may be willing to do for people in terms of ID support. We also know the ministry is changing up a little bit with their strategy or their staffing. They're trying to focus more on creating kind of the more outreach type worker positions that have a little bit more authority and a little bit more control. My little preaching thing is that, in my opinion, this is exactly the type of service, especially if the ministry is requiring it for an application to be processed. Their staff should be doing all of it, but that's another session entirely. Let's talk about Alberta. This is a little snippet from the Alberta application. So probably number 2 in the amount of applications that we typically get next to BC would be Alberta. Not surprisingly, a lot of people come to BC from Alberta. Often after they've arrived in BC, they need to start doing that process where they transfer their paperwork and their documents over to BC, and that's when they need their Alberta certificate. So Alberta is harder than BC, unfortunately, and it has what's called the designated agent provision. So unlike BC, where they just require information, Alberta has a higher level, kind of a next step up, that requires some form of verification. Basically, the person is who they say they are. So in addition to providing the details of their birth, they also want someone to act as a designated agent. And this is if somebody from Alberta doesn't have any kind of photo ID. If they have photo ID, you can actually send that in and you don't need to worry about the designated agent. But in the event that somebody doesn't have photo ID that shows who they say they are, they need to get someone to act as their designated agent. So a designated agent can be anybody. but they need to have a relationship to the applicant. So what that means is they need to have known that person for a certain amount of time. They need to be 18 years old, and they need to have known that person for at least 1 year. What we usually do is if we get someone who's got an Alberta application, often it's somebody who's already engaged with some other type of service in the community, or has somebody in the community that they know that has known them for a year. And what you need to do is get that person to come in and swear the statement that says that they'll act as their designated agent. Now, the catch is that person needs to have a photo ID. So to act as somebody's designated agent, that person needs to be able to make a photocopy of their ID and essentially say that they know that person. They can say that person is who they say they are. So it's a little bit tricky, but once you get the hang of it, it's not so bad. It might take a couple times just to get used to it, but you know, once you figure out how the system works, it's not so bad. One thing I will say too is that for Alberta, if you find yourself getting a lot of requests for Alberta, Alberta has said if you reach out to their statistics office, they have some weird term called like Registry Connect instead of Vital Statistics. But if you reach out to the Registry Connect, you can actually ask them for essentially the ability to act as somebody's designated agent and have only known them for 6 months. That's really helpful if you've got a social worker in the community who consistently has clients who need to get Alberta ID. So for us here in Victoria, the Kool-Aid Society has a number of outreach services. They have gotten their staff to get this special designation from Alberta Registry Connect that says they can act as a designated agent if they've only known somebody for 6 months. Now, that's a considerable amount of work just to get it from 1 year to 6 months. But if you're doing a number of them, if you have multiple people, then it's worth that extra little bit of effort. And yeah, Jen says Alberta's privatized. I guess that's what it's called, Registry Connect. That's the kind of thing you would call a non-governmental office. So the one advantage, I guess, of maybe the privatized is that Alberta is probably one of the only places that will send you an email if your application goes wrong. It has a place on the application where you can put in your email as a contact information. And if something is off with the application or they're not happy about something, they will send you an email to let you know and you can correct it. Usually you have to go through the kind of old bureaucratic methods of talking to people by phone or fax. Alberta does have the ability to figure stuff out by email. So number three in the kind of list of probably likely requests you'll get is the Ontario application. So that's what's up now on the screen. Ontario is kind of like a mix of BC and Alberta, where it doesn't require a photo ID or designated agent like Alberta, but it does require what's called a guarantor. It also requires an insane amount of detail about somebody's birth. So if you look at the bottom half of that sheet, you'll see in the top half too, so who's the person, the subject, the birth certificate. It asks you for the name of the hospital where they were born, it named the type of attendant, so whether or not you were born through a physician or a midwife. All of this stuff is not necessary for every single application. As your weight at birth, for example, number of holding siblings. This is kind of Ontario's way of just saying, give us as much information as you know, and then we'll decide whether or not that's enough to determine that you are who you say you are. Not really the best system, in my opinion. But if you do have somebody who knows a lot of that information, it will make it easier. But the problem, of course, is you don't know where that line is, and it's going to be drawn differently every single time. You can send in one to Ontario that has some of that information, and they'll kick it back and say, not enough information, we need to know this, or they'll accept it, and you have no clue what they're going to accept and what they won't. In Ontario, when you send one in and it gets rejected, you will get a letter from Ontario, and that letter will say, here are the things that need to be given to us. So they'll have line items, the things that need to be provided. It's incredibly frustrated. I can't tell you how many that we've sent out that had that information on the application, and then we got a rejection letter that said, please provide us with the mother's maiden name. That's like literally was on the application. So it's a bit of a process with Ontario if it gets rejected. The other thing is that send in your responses to Ontario. they require the client to sign that sheet. So they require secondary contact with the individual. They have to come back in, fill out the information that's missing, sign the form, and then you send it back to Ontario. So for that reason, probably Ontario has the #1 kind of like lack of success rate from all of the work we've done on IDs. By far the most that get bounced, and by far the hardest to do, because the other thing is their turnaround time is really slow. So you send in an application to Ontario, you might get a rejection letter in about 2 months' time. At that point, you've got to re-engage with the client, try to track them down, try to get them in to give the supplement for information, send it back to Ontario, and then it might take another couple of weeks before that. So Ontario kind of grinds you down. It's the hardest just in terms of the bureaucratic mess that you have to go through. The other real big barrier with Ontario is they require what's called a guarantor. So again, if you don't have photo ID to show who you are, if you can't attach a picture with your application, which is the vast majority of people who are looking for birth certificates, Ontario has you fill out a guarantor, guarantor section. And that section is the next page, hang on. It's not as simple as Alberta, because Alberta, you can have someone act as your designated agent that doesn't have a profession attached to them. In Ontario, the guarantor has to be this kind of old school notion of professional, whatever professional on this list of professionals. That person clearly can tell you that that person is not lying. It's that barrier that exists, and honestly, it's the like kind of overemphasis on the honorable professions that exist. This is really, when you look at it, kind of a classic colonial mentality we've bestowed upon these venerable professions like chiropractor, the honest kind of designation that they can decide who's saying this, that they are who they are. Thankfully, they did add social worker and registered social worker. So that's probably the #1 likelihood you're going to get for someone who's acting as a guarantor. Also, if somebody does have access to a family doctor, that person might be able to act as well. The only good thing about this section is that it doesn't require the guarantor themselves to actually sign and fill out the information. You can fill it out. You can say who the guarantor is and what their contact information is, and then you can send in the application without having the guarantor sign them. That is obviously a kind of a huge barrier if you have to get the guarantor to sign them. And for somebody like a medical professional, or a lawyer, just getting them to say yes, they'll act as the guarantor is enough. Now, there's nothing specifically in the application that says the guarantor has to agree to act as the guarantor. Obviously, that's best practice. If Ontario is going to call somebody's office and say, we need you to act as the guarantor for this person, it's much, much better if that person has a heads up that's going to happen. If you're in a really tight one, if you're really in a pickle, you really want to get an application in, and you can't get that professional, whoever it is, to just get back to you and say it's okay. It is possible to put in the application with their information and then leave it to Ontario to decide whether or not they need to call that guarantor and ultimately confirm that person's identification. I can tell you from experience, I don't believe that it happens very often, to be perfectly honest. Not to say that they won't call a guarantor, but I don't think it's the kind of system where every single time they receive an application with a guarantor, they're going to call that individual to make sure that person is who they say they are. Probably a lot of that's going to depend on how much information is provided in the first part of the application. I'll quickly go over some of the other provinces, because those are really the big three, not surprisingly, where the kind of most population in the country is located. But every province has a different application. The Prairies, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba, probably the easiest you'll come by. Relatively, very similar to British Columbia, straightforward application that just requires birth and family information. Again, if you don't have all the information, attach a cover letter. They're pretty receptive to that. And especially if you identify that your client is unhoused, doesn't have access to, stability in terms of housing, that's going to probably make it easier for an application to go through. Talk about Quebec in a minute. Quebec is by far the hardest application province in the country, I should say. The Atlantic provinces, they're all a little bit more unique. Again, relatively similar in the application process. The one thing that I would say is different about the Atlantic provinces is they're much more likely to send a follow-up letter that says they require additional information. They kind of like to make you do that extra little step, especially Nova Scotia. It's very, very common to submit an application in Nova Scotia and get a letter back from them saying, give us this information, tell us this. And as long as you can tell them that, then they'll process the application. So not nearly as hard as Ontario, and they'll go a lot faster than Ontario, but still creating a barrier that's often pretty difficult for some clients who are going to be difficult to get back into contact with after an application's made. My favorite applications by far are the Northern Territories, because they're like actually excited to receive the paperwork. I had an application we put into Nunavut once, and it was like the turnaround was like 2 hours. It's like the mail arrived, they opened the application, immediately stuffed in the birth certificate and sent it back to us. Like it was like the first thing they'd had to do in weeks or something like that. We have never had a problem with the territories. Maybe Yukon a little bit, but for the most part, if you've got someone who's looking for a birth certificate in the territories, and it really comes down to population size, they're going to be a lot less skeptical that somebody is trying to get their birth certificate because they don't have that many people, probably by the same name. If they've only had one person that's ever been born in the territory that has that name, they're not obviously going to be suspicious that someone is saying they're different than who they say they are. Let's talk about Quebec. So Quebec is, honestly, you could do a session entirely of its own in Quebec. Quebec is like all the parts of the other provinces put together, all the barriers that each province has combined into one massive barrier with a little bit of a language barrier put on top. So the long and short of Quebec is that it's a really tricky process, and you really have to warn your clients that it could take multiple attempts to get an application submitted and to get an application confirmed. So the one thing I'll say about Quebec is they typically process pretty quickly. So unlike Ontario, you're not going to be waiting multiple months to hear from them. The flip side is that they just love to reject an application for whatever reason possible. And they have the highest level of barrier in terms of what you need to submit your application. So Quebec is the only province that not only requires photo ID to show who you are, but they also require proof of address. And that, of course, not surprisingly, is going to be a gigantic barrier to the significant amount of people who are unhoused who were born in Quebec. So, and the thing about Quebec is that they don't actually tell you anywhere in the application about what you're supposed to do in the event that somebody doesn't have those things. And for us, it was a very, very long process to establish with Quebec what needs to be done when someone doesn't have proof of address because they don't have an address, or they don't have access to photo ID. So there are really two ways to do it. The first way is by far the best way, but it's not going to be a way that a lot of us have access to. And a lot of law foundation programs don't have the level of lawyer support that some of the more urban ones do. So it's not as simple. But what we have found to be the most effective way to get somebody's ID if they do not have either photo ID or proof of address in Quebec is to make an application for them. And if you have a lawyer, or if you have access to a lawyer, the best way to do it is have the lawyer make an application on their behalf and say that they need an ID for their client. And the Quebec application does allow you to apply on someone else's behalf for them. Now, typically what we found, though, is that that only really is going to work if that person has a professional relationship to the client. So another option, of course, would be to say if somebody's acting as a social worker or as a social work type relationship, counsel relationship even, there typically needs to be a professional relationship between whoever is making the application and who the person is that's trying to get their birth certificate. So if we send off an application to Quebec and we say, I'm trying to obtain a birth certificate for this person as their lawyer, this is the reason why we need it. This is the reason why they don't have photo ID. This is the reason why they don't have proof of address. Typically at that point, you might get an application successful Because in Quebec's mind, if they want to help facilitate that professional relationship, it's more about that than it is confirming ID. And of course, there's that, again, that inherent professional trust. They're looking at a professional making the application and saying, well, I don't think this person would lie, so I'm going to trust them. In order to do that, what we have typically done is we will send in, an extensive cover letter, a photocopy of the applicant's ID, so whoever is making the application, which would be the lawyer, social worker, as well as whatever professional documentation they have to prove that they are who they say they are. So when I've made applications for Quebec, I usually photocopy my Law Society member ID, so that goes in with the application. You're doing as much as you possibly can to show that you have that professional designation. If you don't have access to that, like a lot of us don't, it's worth asking if you have a supervising lawyer in your program that's actually located where you are. That's one option, but more and more, we're seeing that happen less often. So if you don't have that, the second option is to try to get someone to act as a guarantor. So again, one of the trickiest things about Quebec is that they do actually have this bypass system, but they don't tell you about it. And often to obtain the documents that you need, like the guarantor form for Quebec, you have to engage with them, and you have to engage with them in French. So I will just say that basically, if you find yourself in a situation with Quebec where you need a copy of the guarantor form, there you go. There's actually a link to it. Thanks, Jen. So that's the easiest way to get it. It is in French. So the translation of that, if you need it, I can give you. So the form itself is only in French. If you need to know what specifically those things are asking for, they did Vital Statistics in Quebec provided us with a document that essentially translates that form for you. Now, the thing about the guarantor in Quebec is, like, unlike Ontario, it's not just enough that you have a professional. It has to be a professional, but that professional needs to sign it. And preferably that professional themselves should be from Quebec. So if you have a guarantor that's not themselves from Quebec, then you're supposed to provide a cover letter saying we couldn't find a professional from Quebec to act as a guarantor, so we had to use this other second-rate guarantor from some other province. So there's just so many hurdles to go through. Basically, if you find yourself really, really trapped in Quebec, I'm just going to suggest you reach out to me, send me an email, and I can try to help you through that process, because there's just so many little tricks that come along with it. I will say, if you find yourself having to do a lot of Quebec applications, you're consistently trying to get Quebec applications, the service in Victoria that's now doing the ID clinic, the Community Social Planning Council, they actually took the time consistently. They had to do multiple attempts, but they reached out and they got a contact at Vital Statistics in Quebec, and they were able to establish that relationship, like I mentioned here in BC, where basically if their program sends an application to this person, they'll treat it differently, and they'll process it as if it's a normal application without all the hoops to jump through. So that is one option. If you find yourself in need of that connection, then let me know, and I can put you in touch with a person here in Victoria that established that, and they can tell you how they pulled it off. But for most of us, you're going to get a Quebec application every once in a while, and you're just going to have to do your best to go through those extra steps to try to get that verification. Now, we often forget when we get into these IDs, because of all the guarantor things and all that the best thing you can do, and the thing you should always ask, is whether or not your client does have a photo ID. Occasionally, you'll get someone who needs a birth certificate, but they've got their photo ID. And that typically is going to be the best thing that you can do. You can copy that photo ID and submit it with an application. In most provinces, that's really going to be all you need. But in Quebec, if you don't have the photo ID and you don't have the proof of address, you need to account for it somehow. If you send in an application without the explanation for why a professional applying on their behalf, or without the guarantor form, 100% it's going to get rejected. I'll open up for questions here in just 1 minute, but I want to talk really, really quickly about international ID. So you will get people, of course, who are not born in Canada, and trying to get a primary identification for them can be a very difficult process. So typically what we do if we get someone who's born outside of Canada is you look at whether or not their birth certificate is attainable from wherever they were born. Sometimes that's going to be something that's possible. Sometimes they're going to be born in a place that has a relatively straightforward application process they can engage in. A lot of the times they're not. Probably most of the time they're not. So as an alternative to that, if you're not able to support that person, and often that's going to be because of, if that person comes from a country that has services that are in a completely different language that you're not familiar with, then you're not necessarily going to be able to help them with that application. As an alternative to that, we have had individuals who've gotten help from their consulate. So, here in Victoria, we've had a couple of people that have have to go to Vancouver, make a trip to go to see their consulate and talk to that service there because they can help with ID services. The problem is there's no consistency. Whether or not A, they have a consulate that's accessible to them in BC, B, whether or not that consulate's the type of consulate that will help someone with ID services. All of those things vary. So it might be worth looking into, but it's not a consistent way you're going to be able to help somebody. Now, typically, if somebody is in Canada, they will have a document that shows that. And for all intents and purposes in Canada, that first document or their confirmation of what their official status is in Canada is supposed to be essentially their primary ID. So now if you've got someone who has that status, so if they've applied for permanent residency or they've been granted permanent residency, if they've been granted citizenship, then what they need to do is go through Citizenship and Immigration Canada to get that primary ID. That process is almost similar to getting a birth certificate. It's almost like the Canadian birth certificate, but it's not straightforward, and it's an entirely separate type of application system. What we often do, if all else fails, is we'll actually refer somebody to the constituency assistant of the MP's office. So most ministers of parliament, their home office where they're located will have a constituency assistant. That person's role is to help, much like the community advocates in our network do. For whatever reason, we found they typically have an easier time because they're a federal constituency assistant. They're engaging in the federal system. The federal bureaucrats are going to receive that application from them maybe a little bit differently or better than it would be coming from a community advocate. So that's typically the number one referral we make when someone needs an immigration document or a citizenship document, is to send them to their constituency assistant's office. Sometimes you're going to get somebody who doesn't have status in Canada and who isn't actually in the country legally. Obviously, that person you're not really going to be able to get that primary document for. Their only option at that point is to see whether or not they can get their international birth certificate. Those clients are obviously going to be very rare because if they don't have that status to begin with, their ID isn't really going to help them access services because they're not going to necessarily qualify for them. So there, of course, is a bit of a middle ground there. If you've got someone who's in the country on a refugee application and they don't necessarily have permanent resident status, but they have status as a refugee claimant. So again, that's that first document in Canada. Used to be the record of landing, used to be kind of like that principal document. Now it's been surpassed by other things. But everybody who has arrived in Canada and checked in with immigration should have that document. And that document can act as their primary ID. And whether or not someone with refugee status has access to certain benefits, obviously the provincial benefits is relatively straightforward. Whether or not they have access to other things like municipal benefits is often up to the municipal government, whether or not they're going to allow that person to qualify or not. So it's a bit of a tricky world when you've got someone with an international ID, and that's for that reason we often send them to constituency office if you can, because the federal world is kind of their world. And that's pretty much it. So I'm going to try to make this disappear and open it up for questions if anybody has any. And I think probably the best way to ask questions is in the chat. I'm not sure if these large ones give you the option to raise your hand, but fire away anything in the chat. Maybe I'll talk a couple minutes just about I guess ID in the bigger sense. My personal philosophy with ID is that it's often overlooked as kind of one of the types
Hey,
of
it's JP. Is
hi, JP.
Taylor available?
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no worries.
Oh, I think JP's on the phone. It's gonna meet you, JP. It happens. Zoom world. Yeah, I think one thing that I would encourage just from the beginning is to think about opening files for ID applications. You can get into a lot of trouble if you try to help somebody submit an application but don't actually create paperwork for it or record around it. Because like I say, it might seem like a straightforward application, but they can often go wrong. And when they do, it's really nice to have that record to show what you've done. So what we did with our system is we have a separate kind of like spreadsheet where we keep track of our ID files. If you don't have an ID or an open file for that person already, you can open up a file with whatever database system you have. And that's just a really important way to track when an application was sent, whether or not it was received. The other thing is if you've done a number of applications over the years, then you start to see people come in. You start to have someone come in and say, I think I need to pick up my ID. And they might not remember that 6 months ago, they actually came in and already got their ID. So if you don't have the kind of file system that actually tracks your applications of what happened, you might find yourself in a situation where someone says you have my ID and you say, no, I don't. And there's no way to actually show. We typically also have our clients sign just a really, really basic sheet that confirms that they got their ID. If we made an application for them and it arrived, then we act as their address for them. And a few times now, I've had to show somebody that slip to say, no, here it was, you actually picked it up a few months ago. And there's no judgment in that. It's just kind of like, they might not realize that they got it, lost it again. And then it's usually a conversation about whether or not they need to do another application from there to get a replacement if they don't have it anymore. But record keeping is important. And, especially with those ones like Ontario applications where the whole thing could take 6 months. You might think in 6 months' time you're going to remember exactly what happened, but you might find that's not the case. So treat it like it's a regular file, that it's just as important as any other work that you do, and can't really go wrong from there. Yes, and absolutely. The spreadsheet that we operated was designed to be a bring forward system. Yeah, and I'd be happy to share that if anybody wants it. I'll send it to you. It was, very basic, like just spreadsheet where it says, date open, date sent, date received. We also had it set in there as a reminder too, because we often have clients where you have contact information for them, but when their ID arrives, you might not be able to reach them. So our spreadsheet also acts as a reminder to try to consistently call that person to make sure you try to make contact with them. The other thing that I always say, especially with ID files, is that never get one form of contact. Get as many as you possibly can. Get a first, get a second, get a third if it's at all possible. And often the third can be, where do you like to hang out? What's the most consistent spot in town that I can find you? And it doesn't have to be a community center, an agency, it could be the Tim Hortons. Just tell me where I can find you. So if your phone's not working, if this email doesn't come back, if the number that you gave me for a family member doesn't get through, what's the most likely place that I can get a message to, or I can go and I can find you at? It's often that's the most successful in tracking somebody down, even more reliable than somebody's phone number. Because for a lot of people in our world, phone numbers are entirely dependent on income. A lot of the newer services that provide you with text services or like really, really cheap or free phone service, the catch is that they actually can take your number away from you at any given moment. So if you have people that put a number down, like I don't know if you have anybody that started to use text now can be a really, really great thing because it's a free texting service, but at any given moment they can take your number away from you. So it's really good for you to be able to reach out and text somebody. It's not a good service for you to be able to find somebody. So taking that extra minute during an application to just sit down with that person and say, tell me every single way I could possibly get a hold from you will save you so much headache down the road. Because one of the worst things is when you go through the process, you get someone's ID, it shows up, you know that person needs it, and you can't find it. And it's just sitting there on your file, waiting for that person to reappear. Often if they do reappear, you know, it's not for a good reason. It's because they're in crisis. Their benefits have been put on hold for whatever reason. They can't access the thing they need to access. And it's always better if you can get the ID in the place where it needs to go before you close the file. So Andrea, I'll send you that spreadsheet just by email. And if anybody else wants it, just give me a shout. I'll put my email up here in the chat. I'm always happy to talk about ID, whatever form, just give me a shout. When I started to do this work, I never thought that I would spend so much of my life making birth certificate applications. And we very kind of casually took on the ID clinic in Victoria. It was a joint initiative with the MLA's office. Really didn't think it was going to be a big thing, and then found out that it's a gigantic need in the community. And it's an extensive service. So it's one to take seriously, and it's one that honestly, kind of like filing taxes, we often underestimate how much change that can actually bring in someone's life. We often focus our work on the legal advocacy and the legal skills that we have to help people with systems. Sometimes it's those application things that we can do for somebody, which can actually really turn their life around. So I'm a big fan of ID services, and I'm always here for you if you have any questions.
I noticed that there's a couple other questions in the chat if you just saw them, Doug.
I'm not sure if I saw them. Oh, they probably jumped over. Whoopsies. Sorry. I need to scroll. Yeah, BC Services card. So can anyone get a BC Services card with proof of address, but not primary ID? No, unfortunately, no. So it used to be that you could get an MSP card, which proved that you're on MSP, but they took that away. There was concerns about too easy being able to get a non-photo ID. So now to get the BC Services card, you need to have your primary ID and you need to have a secondary. And often the secondary is the problem. We have had many, many clients who we've gotten a primary ID, get a birth certificate for them, especially if they're new in town. Without that primary ID, they've never been able to get a secondary. They don't have a bank account. They don't have a library card. They don't have a credit card. If you've got someone who needs to get a service card and they have their primary but not their secondary, ICBC does have a form, an attestation form that they can fill out. They just hold it near and dear to their chest and they make it really, really difficult to get it. So what it takes is persistence. That person needs to go down to the ICBC office and explain that's the only thing they have. They're not going to be able to get something else. Usually what we do is we send a letter with that person explaining that we've been providing service to them. We have canvassed it. We've tried to find any way of getting a secondary ID, and it's just not going to happen. Usually at that point, they'll give the form. Thankfully, the attestation form for ICBC is pretty basic and it's quite simple, and they should be able to get someone who can attest as their secondary ID, and that will give them the Holy Grail service card. But you know, again, like communication with the offices is really key. Finding somebody in your local office, if you can, that you can have consistent communication with and can be your go-to person when there's a problem, is the best thing you can do for your clients. If you've got someone in your local office that you can create a rapport and a relationship with, they can cut through that bureaucracy a lot better than just doing the applications every time. Photocopies of ID accepted when applying for other ID. So often the application itself will require a photocopy of ID. So most provinces, like Ontario, Quebec, obviously, their preference is that the application comes in with a photocopy of ID. If you don't have it, you should have an explanation for why you don't. But so in that sense, they are accepted. And you can, there isn't thankfully a province that requires you to send in your actual document to get your document. So photocopies are always fine. We often get asked to do certified true copies of an ID. When we first started the ID clinic service, we actually put that in, like every time someone would get a birth certificate, we ask them, do you want a certified true copy that we keep as backup? Unfortunately, what we found is that they don't really do much. For the vast majority of times when someone needs their ID, it's because they can't get something, and that thing that they can't get isn't going to take a certified true copy as an alternative. It's better than nothing, but it doesn't actually open a lot of doors for you. So what we found is that, for time and effort, certifying true copies of the ID doesn't really help that much. The other thing we found is that we kept asking people, well, do you want us to certify a true copy when it comes in and keep it on file? To do that, you have to open up the application, the ID, take the ID out, certify it. A few times we had people that were just really not happy about their ID being opened before they got it. And that was something they didn't realize when we said that we wanted to do a certified true copy. So that's an important part of that conversation as well, is making sure that that person understands that in order to do that, you have to open up. And I think the one that I'll flag to is when you're applying for a Quebec application, it's really good to tell the client when you get communication back from Quebec, you're going to have to open it, because Quebec is the only province where it's really not obvious whether or not they sent you a birth certificate or a letter telling that you're not going to get a birth certificate. All the other provinces, you can tell that it's a birth certificate because it's a different size envelope, the size of a birth certificate. You know when you've got a success. Quebec is the only one that sends it in a regular letter size because the birth certificates are so small. So you'll get a letter from Quebec and you have no idea whether or not there's an ID in there and you're successful, or whether or not there's a letter of rejection in there. So really good practice to tell your clients from Quebec when it arrives, are you okay with me opening it, to see whether or not we are successful or not. Because otherwise you're going to have to call that person, have them come in, you open it there, and then they get a rejection letter. That's not a fun scene. So it's better that you're able to call that person and make sure that they understand that it's been rejected, instead of having them figure out when they think they might have gotten an ID. So on the second one, understand you can get a BC Services card or ID with an alternative address application. So a nonprofit acts as an address, but the card doesn't have an address on it. So that is a workaround. The thing that I will caution is that there are times when you can act as an address for somebody, and that's the single transaction type of thing. So the problem that we have had is that if you act as an address on a BC Services card application, you're going to start receiving that person's mail, and you're going to start receiving probably a lot of mail. And for a lot of our clients, you might start to receive a variety of things. We have often had people where if we act as their address on an application, we start to receive collection letters from MSP if they have ambulance bills. You start to get a wide variety of like provincial collection services. Can be very awkward to start receiving everybody's bills for them. So it is a possibility. I really don't recommend it. Unless it's a nonprofit that's specifically okay with that service. So here in Victoria, Our Place Society has kind of like formally said they will act as an address for people and they have the infrastructure to deal with it. If you're just doing it, I wouldn't recommend it. And because it can create a long-standing kind of like relationship and awkwardness. The other thing is if that person starts getting benefit checks that start getting mailed to that address on file and get to your office, the last thing you want is to start getting them. We had a number of clients that we acted for. We used to allow people to use our address to file taxes. And then when CERB started running, we started getting people CERB checks because their address was their address on file. So people we hadn't seen in years, we started getting CERB checks sent to our office. That was a nightmare. And we felt terrible about it because a variety of people we couldn't get a hold of who thought that they were about to get a bunch of money. I hate to say it, but possible, but I wouldn't recommend it. I would say it's worth the extra effort, just maybe attestation form. Couple more at the bottom. Anyone have funding sources to recommend for seniors to get help with ID application fees? Yeah, great question. I mean, again, like such a disparity, whether or not you're in an urban center or not. We luckily have like seniors entitlement services here that can specifically help seniors. You know, if possible, dedicated ID services are definitely the best. we know that the Law Foundation is starting to recognize that ID services are going to be part of programming. So, you know, and the more that we can kind of like tell the Law Foundation that and show that to them, then the better. One of the reasons why my hope is if the Law Foundation does roll out this big database that they say they're going to, that there's room for that type of thing to be recorded, because it's often a statistic that doesn't get shown in the Law Foundation reports. There isn't really a space where you can say, here's all the people I helped get ID, kind of as a secondary thing with the other service we're providing. So, you know, unfortunately, government itself isn't really supporting too much with ID. The one suggestion I can have there is that, you know, our ID clinic that we had in Victoria was originally set up by the MLA's office. So that was Carol James' office. If you have an MLA that you think might be up for something like that, we often found working with them as a government kind of like offshoot office is one of the ways you might be able to get a little bit of funding. Sometimes those offices have access to kind of these weird kind of slush funds, which when the budget rolls around every year, they have the ability to grant out. So it wouldn't be a bad thing to reach out to your local MLA and just say, you don't need that much, right? Like we had, if you're not covering staffing costs, you can go a long way with a couple $1,000s. Can last you quite a long time. So we also received money from City of Victoria and the Victoria Foundation to do an ID project. Because again, if you're not trying to cover staffing time and costs, if it's just application fees, then typically you can ask for a couple $1,000s and it's going to go quite a long way. Okay, I'm back. Yeah, sorry about that. Probably my cue. Call it a day. Ooh. I don't recommend getting whatever virus I had a couple weeks ago. But such is life right now. Thanks again, everyone. And thanks again for coming back for a second round. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. Thanks for persevering, Doug. You sound like you're still fighting that cold.
Yeah, unfortunately, yeah.
Yeah.